Every time we make grand plans, whether it's adapting to existing risks or planning for the future, there always has to be, there has to be some sense of what are the biophysical limits or the constraints in implementing these idealized plans sometimes, right? So if you say we are going to deal with future energy requirements and carbon drawdown limitations with bioenergy, carbon capture and sequestration, then people do post facto analysis of just how much land and water would be needed to achieve those bioenergy goals. Turns out to be quite, a severe constraint on relying on such technological promises. First of all, we don't have bioenergy that is really implementable at the scales required, and then you can just say how many megawatts or gigawatts of energy we are going to produce from bioenergy crops, but without considering how much land and water that would require and how that requirement would then compete with food requirements and how food security and vulnerability of the poor people to food crisis will increase because of relying on bioenergy. Already some of these things play out when there is a drought and corn yields go down. Then you still want to have ethanol as an additive, which affects food prices because fuel prices go up and transportation cost goes up for food items, and also because you are still feeding cattle with corn and beef price goes up. So all kinds of cascades happen. So in that context, it's important to understand adaptation constraints for water related adaptation across different dimensions. So you have to consider the dimensions across which you are making these nice plans for adaptation to manage water problems, and you have to then go back and see what are the constraints. There is also nice there are nice papers on economic constraints for adaptation in the water sector. So water is a very important thing that relates to food, industries, domestic use, and of course very closely relates to health as well. So types of constraints here on top: biological, cultural, economic, financial, governance, institutions and policies, human capacity, information and awareness, physical and technological. You can also think of these as barriers to adaptation. Oftentimes we talk about adaptation plans and then knowledge gaps or knowledge barriers, institutional gaps or barriers, governance barriers and gaps, and so on and so forth. Okay, so in the water related adaptation responses, you have the same things we considered before, going from improved cultivars and agronomic practices, changes in cropping pattern and crop systems, down to energy related adaptations, urban water management, water sanitation and hygiene related adaptations, and others including coping. So here adaptation constraints manifest across a range of dimensions and here are assessed based on a meta review of water related adaptation. So you can go and look at these sections. Again, as I said, I'm randomly taking few pieces of information from this long chapter from the AR6 report, report of the Working Group 3. So you definitely need to go back and look at the details if you are interested. Where less than 5 articles were available for assessment, data is insufficient to assess the extent to which a constraint is present. That's the adaptation constraint. Let me read that again. Where less than 5 articles are available for assessment, data is insufficient to assess the extent to which a constraint is present. Where less than 20% of the articles reporting on the respective adaptation option identify the presence of a constraint, is classified as limited. Where 20 to 50% report on a specific constraint, it is considered as moderate. Where more than 50% of the articles report on the constraint is considered significant. This assessment is based on the available peer-reviewed literature assessing adaptation benefits in the water sector. in practice, these or other constraints may still be significant, but have not been identified in peer review sources. You have to also remember that water is very much a local, regional problem. Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent, with Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan facing their own specific issues. And the studies are sometimes very focused on local issues like India or Thailand and wherever else, African countries. And you are mixing and matching these studies without worrying about their region specific adaptation responses or constraints, but you're trying to derive some big picture out of these, so you have to always keep these in mind. So extent to which a constraint is present is either insufficient when less than 5% of the papers are reporting this explicitly, limited for less than 20%, as we said, 20 to 50% puts us in the moderate category, and significant is when greater than 50% of the papers identify constraint. So you can see that large number of constraints appear for all adaptation responses in dark blue for financial and governance institutions and policies. Okay, none of the other constraints here in terms of biological, cultural, economic, human capacity, information and awareness, physical and technological, appear in terms of constraints being significant. Is this good news? For example, if none of them identify significant constraints in physical and technological or human capacity or information and awareness, is that a good thing? Well, I hope so. You can go and follow up on the papers. Okay, so let's do a few of the cross matchings for adaptation responses, water-related adaptation responses for improved cultivars and agronomic practices. You have moderate constraints in being economic, governance, institution and policies, and human capacity, as well as information and awareness, but financial constraints are significant. So economic is where you have monetary flow, and financial is where you have fiscal issues, taxes, spending, bank loans, monetary things. Okay, so I'm not being very rigorous, but just know that economic and financial are distinguished here as constraints. Okay, similarly for changes in cropping pattern and crop systems, you have significant constraint in financial sector, from the financial sector. On-farm irrigation and water management, again financial constraint. Water and soil moisture conservation has no significant, which means basically not enough number of studies have focused on it, so it's not that there are no constraints, it's just that even economic and financial constraints here are only moderate in terms of the number of studies identifying these explicitly. Okay, collective action policies and institutions faces obviously significant constraint in governance, institutions and policies. Migration and off-farm diversification has financial and governance, institutions and policy constraints being significant. Want to read a couple of more. Training and capacity building has significant constraints from governance, institutions and policies. Agroforestry and forestry interventions, either limited evidence or moderate evidence across all the constraints. Flood risk reduction measures have significant constraints from governance, institutions and policies. You may want to go back and follow up on why certain things have so many constraints from governance and institutions and policies versus financial, but not in other sectors, just in terms of the studies. It's obviously possible that studies are a priori focused on these particular dimensions of water-related adaptation responses, so you end up with evidence being skewed towards certain constraints and not focusing on other constraints such as like technological and physical, because you can see that there are limited number of papers on those dimensions, as well as biological and cultural. Okay. Let's see here. Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge based adaptations have severe constraints from significant constraints from governance, institution and policies, and similarly for urban water management. And all others, including coping, also have significant constraints from financial and governance institutions and policies. This obviously relates to which countries are involved here in the studies, because low income and middle income countries tend to be constrained by finance in terms of adaptation responses, and they used to have poor governance, institution and policy frameworks for dealing with adaptation requirements as well. Okay, so it's kind of useful to run through these, even though I'm being quite brief and almost superficial, but at least remember the water related response dimension, water related adaptation responses and the dimensions and how the constraints emerge in implementing. So you can always come up with what are the best adaptation responses for being sustainable and reducing risk in water access, quantity and quality, for example. But then you have to worry about the constraints from biological to governance to physical and technological and so on. Okay, so I'm going to leave this here.